In MotoGP or any racing series, if you get caught not following the pages and pages of rules and regulations, you get penalized. There's no exceptions, it's as simple as that. But in previous seasons of MotoGP, multiple teams were caught cheating at the same time and everyone knew about it but did nothing. How on earth did this happen? Well, I did some digging and this is what I found. Now, just so we're on the same page, we need to go through the rules and regulations and why they even exist in the first place. This is going to help us with the rest of the video. Generally, MotoGP is split between technical regulations, which could be engines, aero, electronics, and so on, and behaviour or riding regulations, for both on and off the track. Obviously, a pretty important point when it comes to racing is the safety. The organisers want to keep everything as safe as possible given the circumstances. So by forcing rules on things like engine, aeros and tyres, it stops teams being able to run away with their ideas and create an insane race bike. There's also a benefit to the racing itself. Say the organisers of MotoGP were scrapping all rules and regulations and simply said, build the best bike you possibly can. You'd almost guarantee that the teams and manufacturers with the biggest budgets would simply run away with it, more than what they're doing now. With no regulations on testing, engine size, or tyres, a team or manufacturer can throw as much money as they want at the problem. And while it's not guaranteed, it's highly likely the biggest team with the deepest pockets would win. Now, even though the rules and regulations are set, every single team combs through these rules one by one and tries to find loopholes around them to gain an advantage. Teams will tend to focus more on the technical regulations, and any loopholes they find could be classed as bending the rules, not breaking them. It can sometimes be really hard to distinguish between the two, especially within racing. But take this as an example. Someone says to you not to pick something up, and you immediately turn around and pick it up. You broke that rule. But instead, if you simply pushed it or changed its position, technically you didn't break the rules because you didn't pick it up. This is what teams try to do all of the time. So what actually happens if you don't follow rules in MotoGP? Well, it does depend on the infringement. A simple warning may be enough for something like exceeding track limits, but if it's something a little more serious, riders may be given things like a long lap penalty, a ride through, time penalties after the race, grid penalties, fines, even disqualifications and exclusions from race weekends can happen depending on the incident. It's all decided by the stewards. So we've established some of the penalties and what can happen if you don't follow the regulations properly. But there's one regulation that teams have been ignoring since all the way back in 2016, and it's all to do with tyres, specifically tyre pressures. I'm going to explain how teams ignored these regulations a little bit later on, but I first want to explain how crucial tyres and more importantly tyre pressures are to MotoGP and racing in general. Tyres are the only thing keeping the bike in contact with the road. As you can imagine, if anything other than the tyres or sliders are in contact with the road, it tends to be very bad. Michelin have been the official tyre manufacturer of MotoGP since 2016, and while they do help to provide some pretty spectacular racing, the Michelin tyre used in MotoGP are notorious for being extremely sensitive to tyre pressure changes, and they have a really small window where they work at their best. So what does that actually mean? Well, if we look at a normal road tyre, they need to work in all conditions. Hot, cold, warm, rain, literally everything. If they didn't, they wouldn't be safe for road use. Well, race tyres don't have to work in all conditions, as teams are able to adjust their pressures to get the maximum performance all of the time. But because they're so sensitive, a really small change can have a huge impact on their performance. Another important factor is that every bike and every rider handles tyres differently. Depending on how aggressive they are at the front, their throttle control, and a myriad of other different things, it can all have an impact. So what does adjusting pressures actually do? Well, you can either increase or decrease a tyre's pressure. Increasing the pressure of a tyre creates a smaller contact patch between the tyre and the road.
The front pressure depends on which bike you are riding. It can affect a lot, and it affects a lot on our bike.
This works the rubber harder, which means more pressure and temperature buildup. Now, this can be useful in certain situations, but if the pressure is too high, then you'll have less overall grip, which can lead to locking of the front wheels under braking or spinning the rear wheels under acceleration. Both could result in a crash or just a loss of time. So that would mean lowering a tyre's pressure would be better. Well, yes, up to a certain point. If you lower the tyre pressure, you have a bigger contact patch and the rubber is worked less. But the bike becomes harder to turn and less stable overall, and the tyres have more compression under braking. In short, there's benefits to both, but lots of external factors like track and air temperature can create fluctuations in the correct pressures that are needed. And it's never quite as easy as it sounds to get it right. And that leads us on to our next point. Teams adjust the front and rear pressures every single session. But the front tyres can generally be considered the most important. The front tyre dictates pretty much everything. How well you can stop, how fast you can enter the corner, how fast you can go through the corner, and even how fast you can exit the corner. So based on what I've said about lower pressures being better, teams will want to get their tyre pressures as low as they possibly can, which obviously makes sense. Well, to stop this from getting out of hand, Michelin set a minimum pressure limit on all of its tyres. In 2022, the fronts couldn't be lower than 1.9 bar or 27.6 psi, and the rears couldn't be lower than 1.7 bar or 24.6 psi. And to help keep track of everything, each wheel is fitted with a tyre air pressure sensor, which Michelin reviews after every single race. That bit is really important, by the way, so just keep that in mind. That is ultimately what multiple teams ignored. They didn't adhere to the minimum tyre pressures set by Michelin. But how is that even possible? Michelin checks the tyre pressures after every single race. How did several teams get away with it? Well, it all really came to light in 2022 after the Spanish Grand Prix. Have a look at this data here. This was a leaked tyre pressure printout for the race. Notice anything that stands out? Both Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin both ran below the front minimum tyre pressure limit for the entire race. Okay, Martin was within the limit for one lap, but that hardly makes a difference. Now, it wasn't just them, and there were other riders who were under the limit as well. But the main issue was Bagnaia won the race in 2022. Why wasn't he penalised? Well, it's all to do with an agreement with the MSMA, which is the organisation representing the manufacturers, and Michelin not to disclose any breaches of these tyre pressure regulations, and more importantly, not to penalise anyone. This agreement's been around since Michelin came into the sport back in 2016. And it begs the question, why have the rule in the first place if you're not actually going to follow it? Personally, I've literally no idea. It might have been to keep Michelin from being in a bad light if tyre pressures were constantly under what they recommend to be the limit. But the bottom line is, multiple teams had had enough. And with it all coming to light after the Spanish GP in 2022, more people started speaking out about it. Now, to be clear, some teams didn't do it. And as you'd expect, they were the ones to call out this blatant rule breaking and cheating. You could argue that they could have done it and then no one would have complained. But that doesn't actually solve the problem. If anything, it actually creates more issues than it solves, as teams will effectively get lower and lower within their tyre pressures, trying to gain some additional advantages. And that potentially could have caused some serious tyre failures. So, what's MotoGP done since then? Well, in 2023, they started to enforce harsher penalties for breaking these tyre pressure regulation limits. They started using warnings and also time penalties for repeat offenders. Personally, I think it's the right thing to do. But by enforcing it so heavily, it does actually raise other points. Mainly being the Michelin tyre being too sensitive and having a really small operating window. So what do you think? Should MotoGP have any tyre pressure regulations at all? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.